my topic today is the employee experience. So I want to frame it before we get into the content. Once in a generation, we have the opportunity to reimagine work. And that started from around the 1800s when we started with the Industrial Revolution. People came out of fields working in the factories. 1921, we changed from the 6-day work week to a 5-day work week. And it was the same discussions that's going on now. 1940, World War II, around that era, women came into the workplace. So we're seeing these major shifts that's coming through. 1990 was the explosion of PCs, desktop, digital age. That was also the first year of the topic of employee engagement by a gentleman by the name of Professor Kahn, who was doing an industrial analysis of the workforce. So 2020 brought us into where we are now, which is the Oscars of disruption, which is the COVID-19 pandemic. Employees are ready. Employees aren't, for the most part. So it comes to this dynamic, which I talk about as the 3 W's of work. There's workplace, there's the workforce, and there's work. And that brings us to the employee experience. It is a business imperative. It's not an HR initiative. So if you think back to that statement I made about 1990, which was the beginning of the discussion around employee engagement, that's been in place for about 30 years. How are we going to rethink that? And what is the actual difference between the two? Because we hear employee experience, we hear employee engagement, but we've always heard the customer experience. So if we think about the customer experience and we think about the employee experience, there could be something there. Is there a connecting point between those two? And why should that be important in today's environment based on all the disruptions that we've had before? So my topic, we're going to take a deeper dive into trying to figure out why it is important for us to understand this is just another disruption we're going through, and we're going to have to basically throw everything out, and that's not a scary prospect, and basically relook at everything we do inside of the workplace. And that's going to be paramount in looking at the experience of employees that we have in our workplace. So a differentiating point between the two is that if you think of employee engagement, and to give some background to that, I was the former CEO for a great place to work based in Middle East, working out of Dubai. And it was a point in time, we went in and we did an employee engagement survey at the end of the year, at the middle of the year. We tried to figure out from the client which was the best time to do it. Lots of times client would try and game the system. They'd say, well, the bonuses are paid in June. Let's do it at the end of June, which we would always kind of push back on if they said that up front. So employee engagement, 1990s version was once a year. How is that going to play out in the new world of work? Will we still wait for one point in time to do that? Think of performance evaluations. We did performance evaluations once per year. All of that is going to have to change. So if we were to think in terms of it, think of it as a point in time. You worked at companies and your tenure may have been 5 years, 10 years. What was the overall experience in working there? Was it a good experience? Some years were better than other years. What would be the differentiating point? How could we track that and try and get a better understanding of the experience of our employees and move beyond the 1990 relic version of employee engagement, which was, for the most part, annually? Now, I know I listened to a podcast the other night on listing strategy from Microsoft and some of the other companies. And Microsoft has a person in charge of listing strategy. In other words, listing from the employee side to get a sense of what's happening and how can we do better. Now, that's an important point I want you to remember, because how often are we asking, how are we doing? There was a mayor in New York years ago, very cantankerous human being, Ed Koch. And Ed Koch would leave his office sometimes, and he would go down to a subway station in New York in the morning, and all you see is people coming out, people coming up from the subway out on the streets. And he'd stand there and ask them, how am I doing as mayor? And if you've ever been to New York and you know New Yorkers, we can be kind of upfront sometimes, but we'll give an honest assessment. And sometimes it was good, sometimes it was bad. But if we think of that same concept, how often are we asking our people, how are we doing? How are things working for you? And that takes us into this new dynamic of looking at how can we maximize the experience of employees over a period of time versus a 1990s version, which was one time per year. Now, 2017, according to my research, this is when the topic of employee experience came into being. Everyone started talking employee experience. That kind of came from the customer experience. So if we looked at customers, same methodology, and we kind of translate that over to the employee side, we may find something. Matter of fact, we will find something. Imagine if our organizations concentrated on customers the same way that we concentrate, if we concentrated on employees the same way that we concentrated on customers. We may pick up something from that. You have some leaders today have always been on that employee experience side. And certain statements they would make whenever they got an opportunity to talk to employees, they always kind of stress that human-centric approach. We hear that term mentioned a lot. So our thinking, based on the framings that I just talked about and leading into this conversation, means that we're on fertile ground. We can take a look at what we have. We can build in new systems. We can really make a touch point, because in the end, talent is going to drive it. It is the most competitive job market in a decade. Talent. So how are we going to max out that experience? Well, it starts with leadership. So here's some key quotes from various CEOs. Let's take a look at the first one, who's a personal friend of mine, and he was a former CEO for American Hospital here in Dubai. And I was over for a procedure and reading the employee newsletter. He had been there 1 month, and I read this statement that he made, and I said, I got to meet this person. And I asked around, he was too busy. So I wrote an article, referenced him, his PR people picked it up, and I got an invite to his office. Take care of the people who take care of the people. Now, if you look through all of these statements, they're kind of saying the same thing. Are they talking about the employee experience? Maybe not. They probably would not categorize it as the employee experience. But what they're saying is that human-centric approach, and our employees are gonna be the ones that make the numbers. Employees are gonna be the ones that create that excitement around the product we have, and they're gonna drive revenue. If we create and take care of our side in making the experience and working there as optimum as possible. Now, you look at data tells you no one comes to work for you and is going to stay 20, 25 years and get a watch. You know, I was in Singapore pre-COVID, and a gentleman told me in one of my sessions that I'm going to be late tomorrow because we're going to tonight is our retirement dinner for people that have reached a certain milestone. And I asked him, I said, well, how the people that you are going to feed tonight, what's the average, what is the tenure? He said 30 years. It was their first and only job. So I went into kind of a questioning strategy. So I said, what was it last year? What was it the year before? Because I'm looking for a trend. He said, it's getting smaller and smaller. So what that tells you is the new workforce will not stay with you for 30 years, will not stay with you for 20 years. Department of Labor, US, like 2019 study, 4.2 years on average. And that's also broken down into segmentation by age groups. The older you get, the longer you're going to stay around. But the key to that is that younger worker that's coming in, that could be your future CFO. That could be your future CMO. And if you're churning in that segment, that's a huge issue. So this is why when you look at turnover, you need to capture those numbers to see where the turnover is coming from. You need to go to root cause as opposed to just making the assumption. Because in the end, having the right talent will drive it. If you don't have the right talent, you're just going to operate and you're just going to be a me too with all of your other competitors. When you look at top performing organizations, this is why recruiters always go to those companies and try and find employees. Because these are passive employees in a lot of cases, but they're good at what they do and they're satisfied because it creates the experience. It creates the experience. So if we think of that, we can possibly link that to the business case. Companies that get employee experience correct, 21% more profitable. And just look at those numbers. So that tells you that there is a business case behind this. But if we go back to leaders and you have a leader that may not see it this way, how do you have that conversation? I had a conversation with someone the other day that they had just started workforce was coming back. And their CEO basically sat in the lobby. This is a true story. Sat in the lobby to see who was coming in on time. Sat there for 2 hours. And he saw people sitting in their cars, maybe they were on the phone or whatever it is. And he went to various cars to tell people, I need you to come in to work. So think of a demoralized workforce that you're working for someone that creates that kind of environment. And this is why the previous slide talked about the leadership component of getting this right, because they play a huge role in making this happen. As I said, it is not an HR issue. It is a business imperative that we get this correct. So let's take a look at who does what. So if you look at this, I want you to, on your own time, I want you to Google the Pearl model, because the Pearl model, which I use here, deals with understanding the components of what is the organization side, what is the people side. And if you look at that from what is the purpose of what we do every day? Can we connect that to what we do every day? How do we get our employees everything they need to make this happen? Now, because I'm in Middle East and the vast majority of my work is in Asia, in some countries, the internet is slow. In some countries, all they had was their desktop computers. They did not have laptop computers. So we make assumptions that we have everything, but they didn't have these things. And they were trying to figure out how to do this. A lot of people were working from their phones. They didn't have access to various files. And it was just going on, and you heard all of these kinds of things. So what is the organization's role in trying to create that environment that people are going to enjoy the experience they're having in working for this organization? Autonomy, healthy and positive behavior. A CEO's out of control. A manager's out of control. Bullying is out of control. Are we stepping up, or we're saying, well, you know how Ron is. He gets excited sometimes and we're just going to let it pass. In order to create that environment, we're going to have to look through and filter through all of the components of a workforce. And that's what the Pearl model is about. rewards. Are employees' efforts and growth aspirations integrated in this new experience model? And we'll see how that works with a slide that's coming up. So all of these are important because the organization plays a role in doing this, because when I talked about leadership, if leadership sets that example, and when I had this meeting with the CEO of American Hospital, we were sitting in his conference room, and I noticed outside that the woman had pulled up, and the gentleman who was parking the cars was writing her a ticket, and then all of a sudden he stopped and walked over to the car door. He helped her out of the car. She was pregnant. She had 2 kids in the back. One was in a car seat. He helped all of them out to put them on the sidewalk, and came back and gave her ticket and told her, when you are ready to leave, have them call me and I'll make sure your car is here and I'll help you get back inside. So if we think of leaders, if you looked at that gentleman's role, that gentleman's spot on the org chart, it was probably all the way at the absolute bottom. But they understood, take care of the people who take care of the people. And that young lady with the kids, the new baby, and all these kinds of things will not forget that. And that's the experience that you want to create, but you create that when you create the experience that this gentleman understood that. And that's what the CEO pointed out to me. He said, this gentleman here, he knows what we're trying to do. He knows that it's important that I take care of him. And if I do that correctly, he will in turn take care of his people. And the last one that comes down to the Pearl model is leadership. I could go on and on and on about leadership. One of the things, because I'm kind of a global person, the leadership dynamic changes in cultures across the country. You have some countries that the leader is always correct. Whatever they say, we don't challenge that, because the management, as they say, is always correct, and we don't have a right to challenge that. But as new workers come in and new workers continue to leave, somewhere, somehow, someone is going to get a sense that we're not doing this right. Our turnover is increasing year over year by X percentage point, and it's costing us a huge sum of money. Why is that happening? What is the root cause of that? And I say root cause because from the consulting side, if there's a problem in your organization, you don't try and reduce engagement here. You go to the root cause, you reduce it here, those numbers will come down. And this is why that's important. So all of those key points will have to be filtered through to try and understand, how do we get this experience and move away from the engagement, 30 years old, 31 years old model, and create the workplace where people have pride in coming in to work for this organization because of what it stands for. And on the left side of that, we talk of pride, we talk of endeavor, extra mile at work. I don't need to be managed for time, because I lose track of time because I'm doing what I'm doing, because I'm working on a project that I really enjoy. How can we create that environment? One of the things we can do is, and this comes back to what I said in the framing, is listen more. Stop talking and listen more. Create a listening strategy so that you can pulse employees throughout the year. Because this is going to be important post-COVID. In order for us to make this an effective experience, we're going to have to listen more and stop talking. 80-20, you know the 80-20 rule? That's what we're talking about. 20 is yours, 80 is theirs. Listening. A perfect example of this is, if you notice, Apple the other day released their new work from home policy, and a group of employees got together, wrote a letter, and it got into the news, and it came up, and everybody was saying, oh my God. And I'm thinking, they didn't think of that? Did they talk to these people and listen to them? Or did they design by conference room, which is what we do a lot. We go in a conference room, all the big shots are sitting there, and we write something up and say, this is the new policy, and it goes out, and everybody pushes back. So these are the kind of things that happen when we don't look at it the right way. So we have advocacy. Recommend, our organization to someone else. What happens? One of the questions I ask people in my sessions when I was doing live sessions, I said, if someone came to you and said, "Oh my God, I would really love to work for your company," and say it was your daughter or your son, can you get me an interview there? Can you talk to somebody about my candidacy for coming in there? Would you feel comfortable in telling them to, yeah, come on in, I'll do what I can do, or would you hesitate? If you hesitate, you're saying, maybe not for my loved one. But meanwhile, you have a queue of people who are sitting in resumes, CVs as it's called here, to try and get inside, whereas everyone inside is trying to go outside. A lot of talk, there's a lot of discussions have been around care, empathy. There was a situation in the UK, one of the big four managing directors said he was sick and tired of employees complaining. They should be glad they have a job and come back to work and be happy with that. The board relieved him of his duties, which was the proper thing to do, because there was no concern for the care of employees, the stress that employees have gone through over this period of time. And then we talk about longevity, working there. How long is that going? How long is that? What is the tenure? Have you tracked the tenure from 3 years ago? For the most part, it's probably going to be less and less and less. It's kind of the new way that employees and the new workers looking at things. They're not coming to you to stay with you for 20 and 30 years. So we have to figure out a way, how do we gauge this employee experience and put some numbers behind it? Evidence-based. So evidence-based means, let me just change the slide here. If we look from the key points of the employee life cycle, and if you notice I have here, I call it the toll gate model. Toll gate model is based on evidence, attraction. What are we gathering from that? What kind of data? How many people applied for that? What numbers can you create in the attract phase? Have you looked at your Glassdoor numbers to see what that looks like? Because all of these are going to play a huge role in trying to figure out where we're falling short. And I have a little tool that was put together here to give an example as to how that looked. But think of every time someone transitions from the attracting point, how many people came into the funnel? How many people came out? How many people were shortlisted? Which was number one? The shortlisted people, are we keeping in touch with them? If there's another opportunity that pops up, or we said we'll keep it on file for 1 year, and we all know what that means. And then we hire these people. What was that hiring experience like? Someone told me, a major brand in the US told me yesterday, they just got an offer, a verbal offer. Meanwhile, they interviewed 6 weeks ago and was told they would get back to them the following week to make an offer. 2, 3, 4 weeks later, they called up with a verbal offer. So she said, I'm not going there because if they can't get this right, I don't want to be a part of that. And she walked away from it. Are we tracking those kinds of things? And this is what we're talking about. Onboarding, what does that look like? Well, onboarding has changed because at one time there was a physical onboarding. Everybody would show up in a room, we had coffee, we talked through things. That's different. But if we're going back to work, that's going to look a little different. How can we create that experience? And I created an onboarding program when I was in New York, and we won an award for it. And it was considered as one of the best onboarding programs. Now, the reason we were able to do that is because we pulse people throughout. We pulse them at the end of the week. We pulse them at 30 days. We pulse them at the end of the probation period. What can we do better? How can we create a better experience? Did we know we were tied into the employee experience? No, we did not. Engagement, surveys, once a month, subsection of the employee. That doesn't mean we have to go through 1,500, 2,000 employees to work it through. Performance management, develop, departure. That means we know that people are going to leave and we understand they're going to leave, but we want to make sure that experience was what it should be. So let's take a look at a tool I put together here, which gives you some insight as to how that could look. Now, I looked at every category here. I can't really see from my side here because the screen is small, but I took every segment of that and I categorized it. So what could I use from those categories? And how can I begin the process of checking that to make sure I'm capturing what I need? Now, when I talked to you about the award that we won and we were featured in a book, and that's when I was at Martha Stewart, one of the reasons we were able to do that is because we wanted to make it an experience. So I wanted people to say, best company I've ever worked for. Oh my God, I've never gone through an onboarding experience like this. So this is why we tracked everything. And to go back for a minute, attracting, how many of you have ever applied, if you're in HR, how many of you, specifically recruiting, have you ever applied to your company for a job and look at their response and see what goes out to employees? That's a customer. At this point, before they switch to employee, what is that experience like in that category? Because that could kind of set the tone. If the young lady would have accepted that role and would have gone in and everything was coming through the same way, she says, I should have known better because this is what happened at the beginning of this process. And this is how we have to begin thinking through this because it is important. So think of every stage and what can you capture from that stage? At every stage, what can you capture? Remember, toll gate. We drive a certain portion of the road, they extract a toll from that part that you use. So if we can look at every particular category and we can look at that and basically pull numbers from that, this is what we look for. Candidacy phase, the onboarding phase. What's happening? 1 year onboarding, 1 year worth of data. 1 week, 30 days, 60 days, 90 days, 1 year. We probably do the same for customers. So why couldn't we do the same for our employees, the next future leaders of the organization? And this goes on to say performance management, which is going to have to change because the once a year model probably will not work. It probably will not work. So companies are building in now kind of a feedback loop, developing managers to have performance conversations once a month. Developing managers having performance conversations at the team meetings. The model has to change. If you look at all of the framing that I talked about, these were years and years and years ago. But now we have an opportunity to create our mark and make sure we can do something and build it beyond this. So why do we do this? We start with why. Why is it what organizations should be focused on this employee experience side? Why should that be important? And I love the concept of starting with why. That's Simon Sinek, the greatest book, one of the greatest books I've ever read. Always start with what. Why is that important? Talent shortage is number one. How are we going to attract the talent we need to make this transformation in our business model? How are we going to attract the employees we need to drive this new strategy? We have to create the experience that people will want to be a part of our organization. Social media's role. Glassdoor has not been good to a lot of organizations. And as a CEO told me, that's just disgruntled employees. I said, yeah, but you had 50 comments around the same structure. So that has to be, it has to be a problem. It has to be a problem. So the next category says your profile, share the impressions online. So what does that look like? Again, comes back to what are people saying? If I can go to the Glassdoors of the world or the LinkedIns of the world and get a sense of what it's like to work there, maybe I want to shy away from that because maybe it's not the place that I would want to be a part of. And this is what we talked about. So you look at Apple, missteps. You look at Google, missteps. And you would have thought that they would have had the capabilities to probably make a smoother transition. But I look at Microsoft and I realized for Microsoft that they were on point, because as soon as the lockdown happened, they started pulsing employees. They started trying to get a sense of what's happening, what are our employees feeling, and they had a strategy from day one. So they had all the data they needed to make this happen. Employees want companies that give them the opportunities to grow by providing meaning and purpose, the big P, purpose. Why do we do what we do? I had a project, it's kind of warm in here. I had a project that I was working on from a major airline here in Dubai. And we were looking strategy cascading. What does strategy mean? And how do we cascade that down to the bottom of the org chart? And one of the key things that we talked about is that we have to understand what the person at the lowest point of the totem pole, where they understand all the big shot talk that you're talking about. Because that's what that means. Can we create a purpose behind it? What's in it for them? What's the why for your employees when you say you want to be X, Y, and Z? And I'm kind of giving this away because this is a slide that's coming up, but it's important that I cover that. So we have to think of how do we create an experience that people want to be a part of it for however long. If it's 2 years, fine, but you go away, we have a celebration that you're leaving to go do something else. Because that person could go and work for someplace and come back and create a huge win for the organization. Or that we said, well, you left us, the old way of thinking, and you're a persona non grata. You will never be able to come back here to do these kinds of things. So a lot of the framing that I talked about, we're going to have to rethink everything. And it's the perfect opportunity to do this. I gave this speech, the 3 W's in India 2 or 3 weeks ago. And we went through every key component of that as to why you should say, blank slate, let's start from here. So imagine that, blank slate, we start from here. But the grounding piece of that framework has to be the employee experience. It has to be that. So how do we think about that? With every interaction, every piece of communication, is it looked at through the eyes of the employees? Will they understand it? What about the beginning stages? And we look at that timeline going across, starting from here. How do we begin to really rethink this and make sure that we create the experience that people says, oh my God, this is the greatest company I've ever worked for, until I decide to leave. Because no one is going to stay with you forever. And we just need to get over ourselves and realize that and make sure that we can create the experience that people want to become a part of that. Leadership is a key. I gave you a slide that had 5 key leaders that were, for the most part, ahead of their times in talking about the importance of leadership and guiding it. Now, even if your CEO, C-suite, someone there is going to have to say, you know what, we're going to have to do better as an organization. We've gone through a tremendous impact for the past 1.5 years, close to 2 years, and we're going to have to rethink everything. And if they're adamant about not having that discussion, you, and I'm sure the vast majority of people on this presentation at this conference are HR people. Influencing skills, that's where it comes in. How are you going to influence these people that this is a business case? Somebody's got to tell them. If they're out of control, somebody's got to tell them. That may not mean you have to go directly to them, but maybe you go to their friend who they have dinner with every couple of times a week, or their families hang out together. We have to begin thinking how we're going to get to this person, and we may have to use a model. It's called surrounding the issue. This is the issue. Who surrounds it? Who can I talk to from here and begin the process of working that through? Transparency throughout. One of the cases that came from, I think it was Google, that they decided that you'd have to go through this process to work from anywhere. And one of the key leaders sent out a note and says, going forward, I'm going to be moving to New Zealand. Never went through an approval process because of whatever reason, and it was moving to New Zealand. People were still waiting in the queue for trying to get approved to move to someplace else. transparency. Same as for you as a senior leader, the same as for the employee that's a marketing manager that may have multiple levels below that particular leader. Key takeaways, all touch points throughout the process. Create your own touch points. Attract. The website. Are we asking people to use apply by LinkedIn? Or are we asking them to fill out this form? And then we say, oh, by the way, we want you to fill out the form. And then we also want you to attach your resume. So you got to take your resume and put all this information in. Plus, you got to attach it. Just apply for a job at your organization and test that process. There's a great case study on Airbnb did the same thing. And the young lady, Jill, was looking at how her process went to become an employee of Airbnb. And she said the first thing she was going to do was fix it. And it was the same thing. They waited 5 weeks, 6 weeks, and they come back with an offer. She thought they'd hired somebody else. And that was her motive to try and straighten this out from her side. Employee-centric, yes. Human-centric, yes. The timelines I gave you in my framing were of a different workforce. Our parents would come into a job, if they said, this is what we're going to do, there was no discussion. They was going to assume that was it because they were looking to stay there for X amount of years, get a pension and retire. But the new worker that's coming in, no, they're not going to take that. And you're going to have numbers, you're going to have talent drains. All these things are going to happen because you are inflexible and trying to operate in a system that was designed 20 years ago. So that my last slide comes up to here. Employees first strategy. The old model is here. The new model is here. Starts with the employees, customers, and then stakeholders. So I want to say thank you for listening in today. But let's say going forward, make the employee experience paramount. Thank you.